I now host Right on Four Corners every Wednesday, 10:30 to 11, when I'll talk to local and regional authors. So please join me Wednesdays here on 90.9 FM KSJE Farmington.
KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, which is officially baby-friendly. This evidence-based initiative is designed to support mother-baby bonding and optimal infant feeding practices by upholding the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding. San Juan Regional Medical Center, officially baby-friendly, and serving the Four Corners since 1910. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, December the 5th. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Micklin. Thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM here in San Juan County, of course, 103.3 FM over the air now in Durango, Colorado. And, of course, you can listen anywhere from our website at ksje.com. Special good morning also to the viewers who are watching the visual radio program. We are streaming live to the KSJE Facebook page and YouTube channel. We're glad you're with us, everyone. Welcome aboard, and thank you for joining us today. Coming up in the next few moments, my guest, local archaeologist Paul Reed, will be joining me talking about a couple of stories in the news recently. So stay tuned for that, everyone. That is coming up in the next few moments right here on KSJE. And then, of course, we will round out the 8 o'clock hour as we do on Thursdays, talking with Jason Kelcoat from Citizens Trust and Investment Corporation about the economy, both locally and globally. So that is coming up later on right here on KSJE around 8:55 today. And then next hour, Mick Hess will take us roving with the arts. Mick is playing some music from the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and Orchestra on the show today. So we hope you'll enjoy that, as well as sharing some arts news with us about all the events that are going on locally and regionally. Of course, you know you can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube, but did you also know you can follow KSJE on Twitter and connect with us on Instagram? We hope you will do that as well. And the weather forecast for today, it is looking like a partly sunny day eventually. Some of these scattered showers should end throughout the day today. 46 will be our high in Farmington, 26 overnight. Partly sunny skies for Friday and Saturday. 46 for high tomorrow, 49 on Saturday before the next storm system moves in, with a chance of rain or snow showers overnight Saturday and on into Sunday and Monday. Highs in the mid to upper 40s Sunday and Monday, and then mostly sunny skies return on Tuesday. And with that being said, let me turn to my guest who is here with us this morning. Joining us from his home outside of Taos, New Mexico, archaeologist Paul Reed is back with us. And Paul, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
Thank you for being here. How's the weather in Taos this morning, or in the area near Taos where you are, right?
Yeah, it's cloudy, a little rainy.
Okay.
I think we got a mix of rain and snow coming.
Could be.
But, always beautiful.
All right, got it. You have a beautiful spot there, that's for sure. So glad to have you on the show, of course, as always. And there were a couple of stories, as I mentioned, that have been in the news, and so I wanted to get your thoughts on them. One of them is this deal with the country of France, I think, and the Acoma Pueblo, right?
Right, and this is unfortunately not an uncommon problem. So the good news is that last month a ceremonial shield that belonged to the Pueblo of Acoma and had gone up for auction in France was brought back to America. I don't think the Pueblo quite has possession of it, but I think they will before the end of the month here. So yeah, great news for them. This was 4 years in the doing. So they became aware of this item in 2015, and then the governor at that point started to negotiate and sort of see what was possible. So, but this is an item that we, in the anthropological field, call an object of cultural patrimony. So this is an integral part of Acoma's ceremonial, paraphernalia, the suite of items that allows their ceremonial processes to continue. So very important item.
Yeah, and so there's I'm sure an interesting story behind it of how it was taken from the Pueblo, right, or removed from the Pueblo, and then to be brought back. I mean, this is over the course of several 100 years or less.
The estimate is that it probably, I believe they were saying it disappeared in the 1970s. So,
okay.
And this was held up on top at the Pueblo of Acoma. Folks have been up there, their ancestral village that dates back to the 1200s, and held in a room that, a specific group of people was responsible for caring for this item, and, they used it in ceremonies and a lot of things that, the Pueblo was reluctant to share. And of course, we respect their right to privacy. And then at some point, someone got access to it, took the item from the Pueblo, and then we kind of lose the trail until about 2015. The sad thing is there's a real market in, ceremonial and sacred items from tribes across the United States. And, people like to collect things, and we all do that at one level or another, I think. But some of these items really cross the line in terms of being just too important and too sacred, too specific to different groups, and really should never come up for sale. But of course, we live in the world we live in, and so this item probably passed through the hands of several collectors, and ultimately ended up being on the auctioneer's block in Paris. This has come up several times for other items. We've had some masks recently that were Hopi from the Hopi tribe out on the Hopi mesas, their ceremonial paraphernalia. Unfortunately, again, people like to possess these items even though they don't begin to understand the actual importance of them.
Sure. Well, and I guess could it be said too that if folks feel that these are going up for auction, that they have been gotten through products to be auctioned off, or do the buyer need to do a little more digging, I guess, to find out more about these things?
Right. I think there definitely is a lot of gray area here. But anything that's a mask or a shield, this is kind of buyer beware at this point, I think.
Sure.
Because it's clear that these items, for whichever group we're talking about, of the hundreds of tribes in the U.S. and certainly other indigenous groups around the world, these items are always considered to be sacred and to be items of cultural patrimony, the way that we talk about them.
Right.
So, it's important for folks to be aware of that. Certainly many other objects go through sort of different life histories and come up for sale. But this is an area where, I think we could probably do more education as well. And I know that the prior governor, Kurt Riley of Acoma, and the current governor, Brian Vaillant, both worked closely with the auctioneer's house in France. And, this is something that Acoma and all the other Pueblos and really tribes across the country have their radar really out for this now. And so they are, real aware when these items come up, and hopefully we can get sort of some of the collector people aware of this. And of course, this was someone in our own state. The individual's name is Gerald Collins, and he, for however means, had acquired this item. And once he became aware of the importance to Acoma, it seems like he did do the right thing at that point. But initially they were going to put this on sale for $40,000, and
right.
When the auction house was contacted, in 2015, 2016, they told the Pueblo, sure, you're welcome to bid on it. We'll pull it, and you can pay us the $40,000.
Wow.
And which is pretty appalling at that point, because this isn't simply a collector's item that's going to go on someone's wall.
Right.
And again, to their credit, I think that with the help of the U.S. State Department and other folks intervening, the importance of the item eventually became clear to all the parties involved.
Right, because it seems a little bit complicated when you're talking about another country and things along that line, and other rules and laws that may need to be followed or at least negotiated around. And as you mentioned, it got involved at the higher levels of the federal government with the State Department. And so I guess this is one of those happy ending stories at the moment. And as you mentioned, it seems like tribes and pueblos are being a lot more active and proactive in trying to track down some of these things or notice when they're going up for sale or available to try to intervene and get these things returned.
Right, definitely. And again, unfortunately, this is not a problem that's limited just to the U.S. So the traffic in antiquities, different objects and items, a lot of times illegally removed from countries, ending up in different auction houses. This is something that many countries around the world are confronting. And, for a lot of countries around the world, objects like this are considered to be owned by everyone, so they're essentially public property. And if those countries can identify, direct linkage to a specific group, then they'll repatriate in that way. In the U.S., different history for us, of course, and a much greater emphasis on private property, which, certainly generally works out for us. But when we get into these sensitive areas with objects that are really critically important to groups' ceremonial practices and their continued well-being, as discrete groups of people, then we have to rethink that a little, I think. So, but yeah, this is good news, and hopefully this will also sort of help set a pattern for when groups make valid claims for, this is critically important to our group, we'd like to get this back, that perhaps we could get these things moving a little faster. Anyway, that's my optimistic view.
Right. Well, I'm optimistic too, and I hope that would, as we become more aware of the importance of these items. You're right. And explain maybe to us, Paul Reed, about maybe the differences in some of these items, because we know that we have a lot of certainly museum and places around the world that have items from these areas on display and things like that, but they're not maybe as culturally relevant or important or unique as maybe this particular item was that made it so important to be returned to the Pueblo. It's not like they're asking for every piece of pottery returned and things along that line. Is that something that there's a little bit of a difference in?
Right. I think we should think about it just sort of having, looking at items in museums and collections, etc., as sort of being on a continuum. So we have items that certainly represent past uses. So like you mentioned, pottery. We have beautiful ceramic pieces from many, many sites that are mostly in public hands, some in private hands. And these items are very important. Tribes sometimes request those items back, but that doesn't seem to be very common. And those are more in the class of, I hate to use the word utilitarian, but, everyday pieces.
Sure.
Some of them can be used for, ceremonies and the like. But as we get into items like masks, like shields, a lot of times pipes and other, ways people use tobacco ceremonially, we're crossing into different territory there. And these items, again, are almost always sacred items. And by the groups using them, they consider them to be, again, this term that we use, items of cultural patrimony. And those really require some different treatment. So, fortunately in the U.S., we have a law that's called the Native American Graves Repatriation Act that essentially required museums starting in 1990 to go through their collections and, among other things, to look for these items that, again, the legislation identified as items of cultural patrimony. And if they have items like that, to then consult with tribes that have ancestry and ties to places. So at Solomon Ruins, we're going through that process now, looking at collections and doing this. And museums nationwide have done this. So tribes are then given the opportunity to look at collections, in person, to look at photographs, and to go through a process of assessing those items that may have been on display for decades, and in some cases even more than 100 years or so, and say, this is an item that really is important to us through cultural patrimony, different ceremonial practices, and this legislation gives them the opportunity to petition for the return of those. Mm-hmm. And that's backed by federal law, and that's a great thing. And then, as you said, we're not talking about emptying out museums and ordering
Right.
the semis to come and to drive these items back to places. A lot of the tribes might want some of these items back, and one of the other recent stories is the return of a number of vessels to Powaki Pueblo that had been back east in a museum. So there are specific cases where tribes go through this, and we absolutely support this, especially for the tribes that have museum facilities and ready to display their own items. So
sure,
that's a good thing.
And as part of this, Paul Reed, some of the maybe rareness or uniqueness of these items, like the like the shield? There's not very many of those around, or things along that line, or the masks. But when we talk about maybe pottery and things like that, we have more of that examples of that work around, and so maybe they're not as rare and not as important to maybe have only on the pueblo or at the tribe.
Right. I think there certainly is that issue as well, and just how many of these items are produced and how they're used. And if they're created as ceremonial religious paraphernalia and then tied to specific practices in a pueblo or a tribe, then those take on much greater importance than, the large ceramic vessels that might be used to serve food, in other settings. So, yeah, there's definitely a differentiation there.
Got it. Interesting. And, of course, we've seen that, as you've mentioned, with local facilities as well. I think I can remember visiting the Aztec ruins several years ago when they were going through, I think, some of what you're talking about, and their museum had empty spots on the shelves with an explanation that the artifact that used to be on display had been removed and was in the process of being returned because of this law that you mentioned. I think a lot of museums have been doing that, as you mentioned. Salmon Ruins doing it now, and others kind of reviewing their collections to make sure that they're in compliance with some of these things.
Right, absolutely. And this is sort of the larger process that we would describe as decolonizing, our museums and our archaeological and anthropological practices. And we're basically trying on a number of fronts to work much more closely with Native American tribes to, up front, talk to them about projects, about museum displays, about existing collections, about a whole range of issues. And, just be really clear to the groups that, that the field of anthropology and archaeology and museums are going through this transition, and we're trying to move away from sort of just a Western view. We're going to collect these objects and just store them in a museum and then offer some interpretation, perhaps just from a scientific point of view, and say, no, if these items are sensitive, we want to return them to the tribes. If they're items that can be left on display, then we want to talk to the descendant communities and ask them, well, what is your interpretation of these objects, so that we really come to a much more well-rounded explanation and interpretation of what's going on. And again, if there are sensitive things, we'll take those off display and return those to the tribes or go through whatever process. So, I see this as really an opening up of the way we address different groups' histories, and stepping away from, what's been this very Euro-American dominant interpretation of other people's history. And I think that most of my colleagues are on board with this. And, we're in, to my mind, a very exciting time in archaeology and anthropology, because we're shedding some of our biases from the past and really trying to move forward in a true cooperative relationship with the tribes, with the descendant groups, whose prehistory and history and artifacts that we're working directly on. So I think it's just a really exciting time from that perspective.
And Paul Reed, isn't there something to be said about allowing these groups of people, these tribes and pueblos, to be able to tell their own story and not have it interpreted by others who maybe aren't as familiar or not as connected, I guess, with their history?
Right. That's a key part of all this, Scott, is to, again, decolonize, deprioritize this European view of, well, we know what happened because, we excavated these things from the ground. For a lot of the tribes, even the process of excavation is not something that they support. So in the larger field, we're beginning to take a real hard look at that and seeing, especially on archaeological projects where we're putting in roads or pipelines or different things, if there are alternative strategies to keep, basically these older sites in the ground, not disturbed, and redesign projects and et cetera. And then when we get to the reporting stages, because all this work has to be reported, for the public, because of our legislation and our laws, but then also saying, we want a Native American interpretation of this, and that's not necessarily an add-on, but perhaps that should be the primary interpretation that we're looking for at this point. So yeah, it really is time for a lot of us to begin this collaborative process, step back, and really help our Native American friends and colleagues tell their stories. And again, I'm very excited about this. Our organization at Archaeology Southwest is going through a transition this way as well, and we're really thinking about every one of the projects we're doing and how to reformulate those, and especially for new work that we're proposing, just to have a series of meetings and consultations with different groups and essentially ask, what are the questions that you're interested in, and are there ways that we can join up and cooperate, to ask some of these questions and hopefully get some answers with some archaeological data if that's appropriate, and with ethnographic data and oral history and, the ethnohistoric sources as well.
Sure.
So I think, yeah, down the road here, we're going to end up with a much more well-rounded interpretation of all these places. And I think for a lot of the tribes, they're going to discover aspects of their own history and chronology that is very important to them and may not be things that get shared with the rest of the world. And that's another process that we definitely support as well.
Sure. And I want to ask you a little bit about, we've talked about what we're doing in the United States, but what about the rest of the world? Are they kind of becoming more familiar with some of these issues and changing their laws as well, or are we kind of ahead of the rest of the pack here? Or are we playing catch up? I mean, what does it look like globally?
Yeah, I think we're playing catch up really in most ways because with some of the research I've done in years past into the laws that other countries have in place. For most countries that have sort of gone through these colonial periods, much like our own country, with people going in and taking objects from indigenous cultures and then putting them in museums. And in the case of, broad stretches of the world in Africa and Asia, North and South America, we have folks going in, Europeans primarily, taking objects and then putting them in museums. So again, we have the Louvre with an amazing collection of artifacts from around the world, the British Museum, certainly many other examples. And what a lot of the countries have decided in the path they've taken in the last couple of decades is to say these objects need to stay in our country. And, we would appreciate assistance in doing excavation, interpretation, and museum work, but we want these objects to stay here. So I think that many countries around the world are well out in front on this. And, for example, if I was to organize a project to work down in Peru or Mexico, I would probably not be allowed as an archaeologist to ship lots and lots of items out of the country. I might be able to arrange for temporary loans to do analysis and the like, but more than likely, a lot of that work takes place in the home country now and is focused on employing either descendant communities and or local archaeologists. So I think we're seeing some real positive change there. And again, this is that larger process of kind of decolonizing how we do the study of archaeology and history and anthropology worldwide, and having folks really have a much greater say and control over studying their own history, their own heritage.
Right. Very interesting. My guest, archaeologist Paul Reed, is joining me from his home in the Taos area this morning. We've been talking a little bit about this return of a shield to the Acoma Pueblo that was going up for auction recently. And there's another topic that we want to talk about too this morning, Paul Reed, and that involves one of our favorite topics, which is Chaco Canyon and the Chaco Culture Historic Park in New Mexico, in San Juan County, of course. And so there's been an update with the Navajo tribe, maybe was considering some legislation as it refers to Chaco Canyon and the area around the park. Is that correct?
Right. One of the issues that we've talked about in shows gone by, and certainly is very very present today, is different ways to protect Chaco and the areas around Chaco in particular. So, as I'm sure most of our listeners know, Chaco is a cultural historical park, with defined boundaries. There's no development or other activities within the boundary of the park. But as we get right outside Chaco, we're in an active oil field that's been in place now in northwest New Mexico for almost a century. And we certainly have a number of cultural resource management laws, environmental laws that help guide how that development happens. But many of us have been concerned now for a few years about the oil and gas activity getting too close to Chaco's boundary and really impacting the qualities that make Chaco what it is, with its dark skies, the amazing structures that are in place, and really just the landscape that helps make Chaco really a place that a lot of people want to go. So we have worked with our partners over the last few years, and we're thrilled, as we talked in a prior show this fall, Scott, to have a bill go through the U.S. House to protect a 10-mile zone around Chaco and a couple of the outlying sites. There's a bill pending in the Senate right now as well, and these have had the full support of the House bill with our New Mexico delegation and with our senators in New Mexico for the Senate bill. And what this bill would do is, and there's been some misinformation on this, and this is one of the reasons I appreciate having an opportunity with this listening audience to talk a little bit about this, because this bill would essentially remove federal acreage and subsurface from development in this area around Chaco. Now, the 10-mile zone around Chaco, our best guess is about a 1.1 million acre area. And if these federal lands were removed from development, this would be about 300,000 acres. So we're looking at about a quarter of the lands that would be protected in that way. And that would still leave different points potentially for oil and gas access. And, we would support that if it was done responsibly. But one of the things that's pending right now with the Navajo Nation Council is a bill, a resolution, legislative resolution that would have the Navajo Nation formally oppose that 10-mile zone and request that it be taken to 5 miles. And this is something that we're particularly concerned about. As I said, sites in Chaco Canyon are protected. What we have in that zone around it, and particularly in the zone between 5 miles and 10 miles, so this area that, we now have consideration of potentially shrinking that, we have 12 ancient Chacoan communities with great houses, with shrines, with road segments, and with lots and lots of other sites where people lived and conducted their daily activities. So we're concerned with a shrinkage from 10 miles to 5 that we would have many more impacts to these sites, which occur on a variety of land jurisdictions. Some are Navajo Nation, some are on allotments, and many are on BLM lands there as well.
Gotcha. And so it's part of this whole checkerboard area that I know we've talked about before, that the land surrounding the Chaco Canyon Historic Park is maybe under different jurisdictions. And so we have this federal law that you just talked about, which would protect 10 miles, but then if there's Navajo Nation land, they are considering this other legislation that would be maybe just a 5-mile radius, and that's kind of what the discussion is about, right. Correct?
Right, that's the core issue, and this comes about because of concerns by folks who hold Navajo Nation allotments, which are lands that are essentially private with some consultation before development with BIA and with the Navajo Nation. And the concern of the allotment holders is that this legislation would basically preclude them from going through a process of leasing their lands for oil and gas and potentially for other activities. And this is just not the case, and that's one reason again why I appreciate being on the radio with you, because the bill is proposed that passed the House and is being considered by the Senate only applies to the federal lands. So the allotted lands fall in that 80% that is not federal, and allottees would still be free to pursue different paths towards leasing and other arrangements with oil companies and with other developers who might be interested in their land. So I feel like there's some misinformation that was behind the introduction of this bill with the Navajo Nation Council, and I think the Navajo Nation certainly has a right to control its lands, to go through its full process as a sovereign nation. My concern is just that the full information be out there, and because the way the resolution was written, it basically said that the bill being considered in the Senate would prohibit, well, it says severely restrict or largely prohibit any oil and gas activity in 10 miles around Chaco, and that is simply not the case. We're talking only about a quarter of lands in federal hands. And so allotment holders would still have options, is the point here. And it's a little unclear to me how we got from real clear language in the bill that passed the U.S. House, same language in the U.S. Senate bill, than to concern about, people's basically property rights being threatened. And, that's not the case with these particular bills.
Interesting. But as it stands right now, though, there is no ban on any Native American land around Chaco for development. Is that true? It's zero, is it not, outside the park?
And there won't be. We are talking about the federally managed lands in this case. And the Navajo Nation goes through its own process, and they have not passed any legislation to prohibit oil and gas activity around Chaco. Now, what we do have is the Pueblo, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, and the Navajo Nation president having a couple of historic meetings in 2017 saying we support the protection of the greater Chaco landscape, and both groups saying that they support these bills. So that's the other thing that's a little contradictory in this process, is the Navajo Nation at its highest level has already said, the Chaco landscape is important to us, to many tribes, and we support protection of it. And we support measures that protect it, including these two pieces of legislation. And we now then have the Navajo Nation Council, considering a bill that would weaken that protection. So anyway, I just wanted to throw this out for the listening audience so they were aware. This is in committees right now with the Navajo Nation Council and being considered. So if folks are listening and have concerns, I would encourage them to, if they're Navajo Nation residents and chapter residents, to get a hold of their officials and, make their feelings known, since this is being considered at this point.
It's going on right now at the current session, correct?
Right. So the council is not in session, but basically just like with our state level government, committees meet.
They're having committee meetings, right?
Bills come up, they're considered, and so this wouldn't go through the council until their next session. But our concern is just that the full information behind this get out, and that people understand that the bills are about protecting sites that have some level of protection, but certainly not what we see inside Chaco, and that the property rights issues and all are clearly addressed. And our Congress folks in the House and the senators and all the groups working with this, we went through all these issues very carefully, and we're sure to include language that would not prohibit folks with private holdings or allotments from developing in the way that the regulations allow.
Okay, very good. Well, Paul Reed, it is a complicated issue, I'm afraid, as always, but it's important to pay attention to some of these things that are happening not too far outside of the city limits here in Farmington, Aztec, and Bloomfield, and of course it's in San Juan County, and it affects a lot of folks. So we appreciate your time this morning to explain it to us, and me especially, so thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet, Scott. I'm going to follow up with some more written material in a blog post that hopefully will be active by next week. And so if folks are interested, they can go to the archaeologysouthwest.org website and, just get a little more info. And we'll have links there to the legislation, the resolutions for the Navajo Nation and what's happened, with our U.S. House.
Okay.
Excuse me, and Senate bills as well. So more info, which,
all right.
Hopefully it's good.
I'm sure it will be, and very important. And again, I would imagine the next session of the Navajo Nation Council will be happening this winter, so it's not too far away. Probably in the next few weeks, I would think January, February, if I remember the schedule correctly. So it's important stuff.
They'll be meeting shortly, and very important.
Right.
To,
all right.
Full session.
Very good, Paul. Thank you so much, and happy holidays to you and your family. We'll see you in the new year.
Scott. Same to you, and always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much. That is Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. He joins me every month for a great conversation right here on KSJE Farmington. Back with more in just a moment, everyone. The time is 8:43.